I think it's impossible, and the experience has shown over the past 2 days, that if you exclude one of the belligerents, then you're not going to reach any sustainable outcome.
This is StratNewsGlobal. I'm Amitabh Revi. On The Gist today, we're discussing the deeper nuances, implications, and ramifications of the Switzerland-organized Peace Conference or the Peace Summit on Ukraine with India's former permanent representative to the UN and distinguished fellow with BIF, Ambassador Asoke Mukerji. Ambassador, great to see you again.
Good to see you, Amitabh.
Lots to talk about. I mean, if you just look at the official website of the conference, the encouraging people who tweeted to use hashtags like hashtag UA Summit or hashtag Peace, Path to Peace. At the end of the day, even though they recognize that this is a process, was this really a path to peace?
No, I think that that was the big disappointment of this event. Because it had been built up with a projection of working towards a process for a peace negotiation. But ultimately it turned out to not identify any path to peace. And even the 3 points that they identified in the communique were not really issues which could lead to a peaceful solution to this conflict. And it's a pity because the role of the host country, Switzerland, which organized this conference, had led to great expectations. Because Switzerland has traditionally been a country which is neutral and therefore has flexibility to play a role of a venue for negotiations. And we've seen that with the Syria peace talks most recently. Switzerland is home and the headquarters of the International Committee of the Red Cross, which is another very highly regarded non-governmental organization mediating in conflicts and trying to bring about resolutions. And this year and last year, Switzerland for the first time is an elected member of the UN Security Council. And since the UN Security Council is the only international body mandated by international law, the UN Charter for peace and security, for maintaining peace and security, I think there were many expectations that this conference would have been organized with focus on the way ahead to a peaceful solution.
Look at India's participation, Ambassador. I mean, there were rumors that possibly, if not the Prime Minister, at least the External Affairs Minister would go after G7. That didn't happen. Foreign Secretary wasn't there. Curiously, as many people have pointed out, in the first document that was released of invitees, Secretary West was, put down as a minister. That may have changed later. But India's participation, your comments on how we...
Well, I think India's participation is in a way linked to what I said about the profile of Switzerland. Because India has been an elected member of the Security Council till recently, 2022, and Switzerland came in 2024. So there's an expectation that as an elected member, the kind of activities that India also pursued during its term in the Security Council of trying to bridge differences, to make sure differences don't become disputes, to try and address issues on the agenda within the framework of the UN Charter and the UN Security Council resolutions. These would have been the guiding parameters which made India respond more seriously to the Swiss initiative than perhaps to any other initiative from other parts of the world. And I think that in a sense that realization that there was really, I do not know in the public domain whether there was any draft of the final communique, but having negotiated outcome documents from multilateral meetings myself, I find it very curious that there was no serious attempt made to even produce a document which would reflect the sense of the House, if I can call it that, could have been a chair's summary. We did that in the G20, I remember, when there were differences. But here there was a communique which was pushed as a unanimous document. And I think that it was primarily for that reason that India decided to dissociate itself from the communique. And India's position, I think, has been vindicated by the fact that 14 out of the participants of this conference have similarly dissociated themselves from the communique. So, in a sense, it became counterproductive having issued a communique. It would have been much better, in my view, if the chair had issued a broad framework and containing the guidelines or signposts of the path to peace. But here there is no signpost of any path to peace.
But the way India handled it, I mean, the questions some raised whether we should have even attended, or if we've decided to participate and decided at this level, then could we have not gone, let's say, the Brazil way, like as an observer, so that you wouldn't have to issue a statement like you had to do?
I think that is a valid point. I do not know how the decisions on participation were taken, because you remember that this conference was prepared very intensively during the election season in India. So I do not know how this was decided upon. But Brazil had actually taken the right position, and as a multilateral partner of India and a bilateral partner of India, I think we could have coordinated our position to be similar to that of Brazil. Because as an observer, you do not have to come out and make a statement which in a sense undermines the host. And that is what the statement of all the 14 countries has ended up doing, that it has undermined Switzerland's own profile as a serious player in the peace process.
And many would say also what is an undermining factor is that the second party to the war, Russia, is not there. I mean, it's understandable, of course. Russia would not have gone even if invited, and the Swiss authorities did indicate that. But, and considering the other players who were there, but how does that sit with this process, so-called process of a path towards peace?
Well, I think that, this takes you back to, at least as far as Ukraine is concerned, February 2015. And most people today are not informed or told that in February 2015, I was in New York at that time, the Security Council met and adopted a unanimous resolution, which meant that all the 5 permanent members, including the United States, endorsed this resolution and endorsed the political settlement of the Ukraine problem at that time through a set of agreements called the Minsk agreements. The core of the Minsk agreements was that the Security Council resolution upheld the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine in return for Ukraine fulfilling its obligations under the Minsk agreement to devolve political power to its eastern regions, where the fighting had been going on. And with this background, when the current conflict started in February 2022, it's for those of us who have been involved with the United Nations, it's instructive to recall that on 17th February, 1 week before the war, the current aspect of the war started, the United Nations itself briefed the Security Council, and it's in the record, that the Minsk agreements remain the only viable political framework for a solution of the Ukraine problem. And the Security Council failed to act on that. So I think that when you take that perspective into account, to keep one of the belligerent parties, Russia, out of the framework of the peace agreement appears to have been also counterproductive. And I say this because if you take the example of the Syria peace talks, which Switzerland is also hosting in Geneva, there they started with putting the parties in separate rooms and then bringing the two together. And that's the way these negotiations always go. That if two parties do not want to talk to each other, then you put them in separate rooms, and as the host, you bridge the gaps. But here there was no such attempt. So again, it calls into question the seriousness with which this whole event was prepared and implemented. And I think that it's a pity because in Europe, and those of us who follow these affairs from the peace and security perspective, they had a focus after the Cold War ended on the concept of indivisible security, which meant that in the process of my securing my interests, I will not undermine your security. And an agreement and a legal document was signed in Istanbul at the end of the 1990s, committing to indivisible security. Now, the framework for this is the Organization for Cooperation in Europe, OSCE. And I find it incredible that so many years after the outbreak of the current stage of the Ukraine conflict, you hardly hear of the OSCE, and Russia is still a member of the OSCE. So if the regional framework created by European countries has not been activated, if the United Nations Security Council is not bothered to take any proactive measures to implement its own resolution, then I find that the door has opened for non-UN, non-OSCE influences to come in, and that has stoked the fires of what I would call warmongering and the use of the principle of might is right. And we all know that the first time this principle had a global impact was during the First World War. And we ended up by saying that we cannot go down this road of might is right. We need international cooperation to avoid aggression. And it was the United States, Woodrow Wilson, and South Africa's Jan Smuts who pushed the creation of the League of Nations, of which India was a founding member. So all that has been thrown out of the window. And we are now back to trying to address the issue of might is right. And for countries like India, which require a peaceful environment and a supportive environment to avoid disruptions to the transformation we are undergoing, might is right is not the solution.
Let me try and break down all these very important points that you just brought up. If I take, say, the Security Council first. The Security Council resolution and the Minsk agreements were the preponderant factors which were used to deal with the situation, and they are kind of being thrown out of the window. Of, not your words, but I'm trying to paraphrase what you're saying. Is there double speak? Are there double standards? Because the Ukrainian President Zelensky would say, now we are in a position to return to the UN Charter. But how can you on one side say it's the UN Charter when the factors with which you're supposed to address this issue are not there? Forget it in the communique. I don't know what happened behind closed doors.
You're right. I mean, when we talk of the UN Charter, it's not only the Article 2 of the UN Charter, which has those principles which we ourselves actually evolved through our Bandung, Panchsheel and Bandung process, the non-intervention and territorial integrity and so on. Those are the principles. But the UN Charter has a specific provision as a legal treaty, which is Article 24. And it requires all states which have signed and ratified the UN Charter Treaty to implement the decisions of the UN Security Council. And I think that that's the point which the countries which are now asking or participating in the peace conference in Switzerland have glided over. They are not alluding to this, that there is a Security Council resolution which has to be upheld. It is a unanimous resolution. And why is it not being upheld? What is the role of the guarantors of the Minsk agreements? France and Germany were the outside parties who were the guarantors. France is a permanent member of the Security Council. Surely some accounting of why France as a permanent member was unable to uphold the Minsk agreement should have been made to the Security Council itself. And they should have taken steps because they are empowered to implement and enforce their decisions. They have Article 41 and 42, economic sanctions or military force. But all that has not been taken up within the UN Charter. So I find references to the UN Charter to be quite shallow, if you ask me, when it's applied in a selective manner.
And again, the history that you were trying to bring up with the formation of the OSCE and its genesis and its raison d'etre, so to speak. Why has that been, and who is pushing that to the background?
That again is very strange for a person like me, because the creation of the OSCE is linked to the signing of the Helsinki Final Act in 1975. And for us in India, at least my generation, we remember that the Helsinki Final Act and the rapprochement between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War, there was no China at that time, it was just the United States and Soviet Union, took place in the backdrop of the American and Soviet foreign policy moves, which go back to the 1971 war in Bangladesh as well. So these are all linked events of that period, but the outcome, which was a positive outcome, multilaterally was the Helsinki Final Act. And for us in South Asia, it was a similar agreement of 1970, a bilateral agreement. So the focus was on a political settlement. Now, if the focus and objective is a political settlement, then you cannot have at the same time warmongering voices being given prominence. Because from 1928 onwards, the United States and India have been together on one issue, which is that we outlaw the use of force and aggression. There was a pact signed in 1928 in Paris. It was negotiated by the Foreign Minister of the United States and Foreign Minister of France. It's called the Kellogg-Briand Pact or the Paris Peace Pact. 15 countries signed that. India was one of the signatories of that. So I think we are true to what we sign up to. But we find it strange when countries which sign to something then adopt a double standard. And I think that is one of the dilemmas facing us today as far as the UN Charter and the UN Security Council and the use of regional organizations to supplement the UN Charter is concerned. And therefore, there will be lessons to be drawn from the events that have overtaken the OSCE for any attempt to create a similar confidence and peace building and dialogue structure in Asia. And are we going to then live with this fear that might is right? And what do we do about it if we have no system like the UN Charter with all its provisions to prevent might being right?
I think you're referring to SICA here.
Yeah. We have a very nascent structure in Asia called the Confidence and Peace Building Measures in Asia called SICA, which is headquartered in Kazakhstan. India is one of the founder members of SICA. In fact, President Nazarbayev of Kazakhstan started this process, and India was one of the first countries which supported the process. We, for many years, have been seconding our diplomatic sort of resources to help the SICA Secretariat. But from October last year, China has raised the profile of SICA by making a Chinese diplomat the Deputy Secretary General of SICA. So if SICA is emerging as an Asian structure for peace and security and confidence building, then the lessons to be drawn from what happened into the OSCE are very relevant for us.
Again, in terms of lessons to be learned from how India dealt with the Swiss peace conference, does it give ammunition for something that had not been laid to rest, but at least most of the world had understood India standing up for its interests in this conflict? But does the way we handled it possibly give both sides more ammunition to, again, rake up India's role?
Well, India, for India, and especially when you look at the transformation of India that we have been undergoing in the past decade or so, the primary focus is on our immediate and extended neighborhood. And in our immediate and extended neighborhood, there are issues which are on the UN Security Council agenda which need to be resolved. And primarily, if you look from the east to the west, we have the Myanmar issue where no initiative has been taken by the Security Council, and even the ASEAN initiative has got bogged down. Now, India's entire Act East policy is held hostage by the problem in Myanmar. So India's priority should be on resolving that issue through this framework of UN plus ASEAN and plus BIMSTEC, because India has now participated in the creation of this new sub-regional organization of BIMSTEC. If you shift to the west of India, then the biggest challenge being faced is from the maritime domain, where shipping through the Red Sea has been disrupted. It has been disrupted by events happening in West Asia, in Gaza, and in Yemen. And the Yemen crisis has been festering for almost a decade now. The Gaza crisis has been festering for 80 years. So India has to now focus and prioritize participation in resolving these crises, because the direct economic impact of these crises on India is visible. The cost of shipping has gone up, the cost of insurance has gone up, the cost of international trade has gone up, and therefore the cost of transforming India is going up. And India does not need that extra additional cost to be included in the ongoing costs of transforming our own country in becoming a developed country by 2047. So, to the east and to the west, there are issues which should be the priority for India. The Ukraine issue was frankly not a priority for India because A, it was already in the UN Security Council resolution. B, there's a regional European structure to deal with it, and we assumed that it would be dealt with through dialogue, diplomacy, through the OSCE. Did not happen. And C, the whole approach of negotiating a settlement seems to have been thrown out of the window. And I say this because while many are aware of the build-up to this conflict and who did what to whom and etc., most people do not acknowledge or do not know that there were two documents which were produced in December 2021 and handed over to the other side, produced by Russia and given to the United States and to NATO, proposing a negotiation for resolving issues of peace and security in the European framework. And on the 26th of January 2022, both these documents were rejected with a one-line rejection. Now, if you are seriously interested in negotiating peace, you would engage in negotiations until you come up with the end result, which can be a compromise, always is a compromise. No party will be happy with what they get, but there is a via media, and that is the process of negotiation itself. But this entire approach has been thrown out, and I think that has implications for us in Asia as well, because how do we negotiate differences? And we need to do that not only because of the principle of finding a peaceful settlement of any disputes, but also the costs. The costs are increasing day by day of not having a framework for negotiation and therefore preparing for confrontation and probably armed confrontation. And those costs are extremely high, and the impact of that armed confrontation is very unpredictable, because probably some feel that this is an empty threat, this threat of nuclear weapons. But, you just need to talk to the survivors and the descendants of the survivors of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. They come every year to New York to ring the peace bell at the United Nations. I've talked to them. And no one who has seen them and seen what they have gone through will willingly want to expose any part of the world to a nuclear explosion. That has got an impact which transcends boundaries. It will not be limited to a few people. And unfortunately, the impact will be felt by the poorest and the most common of people. If you see Nagasaki and Hiroshima, that is what we know. So I think that countries which have forgotten the lessons of Nagasaki and Hiroshima and want to repeat this and think that today we are equipped in a certain sense to deal with nuclear conflict are living in a fool's paradise.
And learning from lessons, you've written about it, Ambassador, in terms of a similar kind of conference. I mean, nothing is exactly the same or mirrored, but you referred to the Bonn conference in 2001 when India participated. It was again international-led or US-led. And what happened then 21 odd years later?
Yeah, I think that is linked with the machinations within the Security Council, which started off in 2011, 10 years after Bonn, with an attempt to reintegrate the Taliban. And I think that most countries in the international community were not aware of the implications of what that would mean. And they thought this would not happen overnight. And I think everybody was reassured in 2020 March by the Security Council resolution, which said that the withdrawal of NATO troops from Afghanistan will be together with a political inclusive government in Afghanistan. But when the NATO withdrew without the political inclusive government in Afghanistan, I think the impact on India was direct, and it was a strategic and economic impact. The strategic impact was that we lost all our assets in Afghanistan, which we had built up over 20 years, overnight. We had to close all the 4 consulates. We had to minimize the functioning of our embassy. And we had no access to any of the 34 provinces of Afghanistan anymore. The economic impact was even more, because by that time we had spent almost $4 billion in development assistance to Afghanistan in all the 34 provinces and in all sections, including the work done by NGO in India called Seva in empowering and employing Afghan women to stand up on their feet, become part of the socio-economic development of Afghanistan. So when all that happened and in a sense erased the Bonn conference and the promises made in the Bonn conference, I think that is a lesson for us to draw when we look at this Swiss conference, because we don't want to go down the same garden path. And I think that eventually dissociating ourselves from the communique was the right thing to have done.
And again, if you want to talk about the joint communique, which we disassociated ourselves along with at least more than 12 countries there, the 3 points there, and the nuclear you've already talked about, but when it comes to whether it's in their self-interest, I mean the parties, or whether there's doublespeak in terms of when you're talking about the weaponization of food security. There are so many elements in that which are again not touched upon or discarded completely.
Yes, I think that in the 3 points of the communique which are specific, I again find it strange to find an omission of the role of, for example, the International Atomic Energy Agency and the briefing they have given to the Security Council on the latest situation around this Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, where the drone attacks that are now the current source of concern are not attributable. Where are these drones coming from and who is operating these drones is not attributable according to the IAEA. So therefore, in the Security Council, the discussion was that this would have to be further investigated. So that is not reflected in the communique. Food security, there are 2 elements here. One is that Ukraine's food exports have not actually gone down as drastically as many people had thought. The fact is that a lot of the food exports of Ukraine have actually gone to the European Union. And therefore, it's a bit like the Russian oil to India going to Europe. The same syndrome is at work, and this needed to be actually dealt with in the communique more clearly. The larger impact of the food security and the weaponization of what they call food is the weaponization of all the economic interlinkages that are part of the globalized world we live in, and that has actually helped India to transform itself since 1992. And the primary focus, if you see the documents in the General Assembly of the United Nations till December last year, has been on a rejection of unilateral economic sanctions. The vast majority of countries in the United Nations have voted against the legality of unilateral economic measures. So this is something that is that is there. And the third element on the prisoners of war again misses the role of the ICRC, which is a Swiss-based organization. So I think in all 3 there's a willful ignoring of the institutions which have the mandate to deal with these 3 issues.
So, Mas, if you want to just recap your thoughts on the lessons not just learned from this particular conference, but the situation in the world and from history and your vast expertise on that, for the implications, the stakes for India.
Well, the stakes for India, I think, are with regard to a regional issue, which for different reasons which we have discussed have not been addressed and resolved through regional cooperation. The second is that the structure which exists, the only structure that exists to deal with it on an international framework, which is the UN Security Council, is not being functional, has been, I would say again, deadlocked, and primarily because of the way decisions are taken by the Security Council, which India has spoken of at the highest level many times. So the reform of the Security Council cannot be put off for much longer, because the figures given by the UN itself of the human element of the destruction and devastation caused by conflicts has increased. In 2015, which we now take as the golden year of multilateralism, when we did the Paris Agreement, the sustainable goals and so on, the number of people affected and impacted by this devastation was 60 million. And today, the UN reports that number is almost 400 million. So it's gone up incrementally and tremendously. And in addition to that, we have had the pandemic, which has upset everybody's lives and plans. So the Security Council reform cannot be treated as an academic issue left to negotiators in New York. I think the Security Council reform has to be brought into a general conference of the United Nations, which is provided for in the Charter, Article 109. And world leaders must meet on the 80th anniversary of the United Nations in 2025 to review this Charter and give a mandate for how each provision of the Charter, including the Security Council mandate, needs to be updated to make it responsive to the 21st century. I think that's important. And the third point, which I think we should take away from this experience of the Swiss Peace Conference, is that there must be transparency and there must be a willingness to include different points of view in any sustainable effort to find a solution. I think it's impossible, and the experience has shown over the past 2 days, that if you exclude one of the belligerents, then you're not going to reach any sustainable outcome. And I find that this is something that we have lived through. The Treaty of Versailles did a similar thing with Germany and led to the rise of German armed militarism and expansion. When we saw, for example, the use of the words enemy state in the UN Charter, they're still there. They refer to Japan and Germany. And I find it strange that these two countries, which should be at the forefront of trying to reform the UN and the Charter, are today on the side of the voices of war and are not interested in reforming the Charter, which calls them enemy states. So if we are to follow the UN Charter, as everybody wants us to, then should we then adopt those restrictions on enemy states which are there in the provisions of the UN Charter regarding Germany and Japan? I think this is untenable. And therefore, we need to actually review the way we cooperate with each other. And I say this because I was reading the other day about a statement by the Cabinet Secretary of Japan wanting to impose sanctions on some Indian companies, I think linked with this Ukraine issue. And I find it incredible that a country with which we have the best of bilateral relations, with which we have the best of multilateral relations, we are part of the group of 4 seeking UN Security Council reform. We are part of the Quad in the Indo-Pacific. Now, if a country like that wants to impose sanctions unilaterally on India, then that speaks very poorly of the kind of world in which we live in.
On that pessimistic note, but with a lot of takeaways, as usual, Ambassador, it's been a complete learning experience from your experience and your expertise. Thank you so much for sharing it with us.
Thank you. Thank you for asking. When you ask the questions, I am prompted to think of the answers.
Thanks again, Ambassador. And for all our viewers, do send us feedback for this particular interview and any suggestions you have for topics and experts that you would like to hear. You can follow all our social media handles for the latest articles that we put up on our website or interviews like this with the Ambassador Asoke Mukerji on our YouTube channel. This is StratNewsGlobal. You've been watching The Gist. I'm Amit Abrevi.